Don't play with it, don't be dishonest. Ay, still not understand.
Bryan, Mr. Michael Whiteley, Mr. Dylan McLean, thank you, sir. Mr. Lamar Simpson, thank you. Mr. Tariq James, thank you, sir. Ms. Stephanie Christie, Mr. Fabian Johnson, Mr. Jazeel Blake, thank you. Mr. Royal Taylor, Mr. Joseph McDermott, thank you. Mr. Jermaine Robinson, Mr. Andre Golin, thank you. Mr. Brian Morris, and Mr. Ted Pritz. Thank you all present, Chief Justice.
All right, thank you very much. And now back with Mr. Bryan. He is now back in court. And so at the point at which we had broken, we're saying that evidence in relation to the fisheries incident, this is the one other than counts 7 and 8, would show that Mr. Bryan was indeed the leader of the criminal organization, and that Mr. Blake and Mr. Prince, of course, the accountant, were part of this criminal organization. There was another unindicted incident. This was in relation to the plan to burn down the Torpedo Loan Company. According to the accountant, he, Mr. Bryan, Mrs. Cole Christie, and Mr. Johnson and another had planned to burn down the store as arson under the Malicious Injuries to Property Act. And that particular type of arson is a serious offense for the purpose of the Criminal Justice Suppression of Criminal Organizations Act. The idea was that the store was to be burnt to the ground in order to convince the owner to apparently change his mind about some matter of importance to the criminal organization. The evidence went on to show that on a particular night, the accountant spoke to Mr. Golding and to Mr. Prince about burning down this building. The accountant ensured that police patrols were not nearby or in the vicinity, and he then called Mr. Golding and advised him of that fact. And then thereafter, smoke and fire were seen in the Spanish Town area. And then afterwards, Mr. Prince was indicating to the accountant how they had gained entry to the property and what they had done. But Mr. Bryan was part of the planning of this. And so here again, you have evidence of a serious offense being planned, showing the purpose of the criminal organization. And again, you have the magic number, 3 or more. That is the accountant, Mr. Bryan, Mrs. Cole Christie, Mr. Johnson. So that those 2 instances, the shooting by fisheries, which was unindicted, the planned arson of the Torpedo Loan Building, which was unindicted, showed that Mr. Bryan was the leader of the criminal organization, in that he was directing how the operations were to be carried out in both instances. Now, when it comes to indicted offenses, there is a murder, eventual murder of Dooley, and here I must pause to make an observation. In this case, you have instances where persons were actually killed. Persons were actually shot. But because of the peculiarities of our criminal practice and procedure, it does not appear they could be tried on the same indictment. So in respect of count 6, which we are going to look at now, Mr. Bryan was the person who initiated the planning for this killing that eventually took place. And the persons who actually did the killing were identified, but were not charged with the actual offense of murder in this trial because of the, as I said, the peculiarities of our criminal practice and procedure that requires the murder to be tried by a jury, but offenses under this legislation to be tried by a judge sitting without a jury. That is how it stood at the time when these offenses were committed. So the accountant tells us that he and the driver were at the accountant's home along with Mr. Bryan when the killing of Dooley was planned. The accountant says that he was part and parcel of the organization and inferentially part of this planning, and his house hosted the meeting where this planned killing took place, or the planning of the killing took place. So as I indicated earlier, there was a trip by the driver. The persons on that trip to kill Dooley were Mr. Golding, who is before the court, Mr. Johnson, before the court. Then there was another trip involving Mr. Taylor and Mr. Blake. And so, showing the existence of the criminal organization. They said eventually Dooley was shot and killed. But the point here now is whether or not Mr. Bryan facilitated the commission of the murder of Dooley, and the answer to that would clearly be yes. In respect of counts 7 and 8, this is the murder of, facilitating the murder of Jermaine Bryan and Cedella Walker. This was a fisheries incident number 2. Summer fisheries incident number 1 was a shooting by the National Police Academy. The fisheries incident number 2 was the murder and arson at fisheries away from the road and inside the community of fisheries itself, where 2 persons died, that is Mr. Jermaine Bryan and Miss Cedella Walker. The evidence showed that Mr. Bryan was the prime motivator and leader and facilitator of this attack. The evidence showed that they had gathered by a church while they were there. What appeared to be firearms were being distributed, and in evidence, Molotov cocktails described by one of the witnesses as having gas, sand, nail, and a piece of cloth. And incidentally, the cause of death of Miss Walker and Mr. Jermaine Bryan was gunshot injuries and not from smoke inhalation or dying from being burnt in the fire. So inferentially then, the firearms were present before the shooting, when they were leaving from beside the church, and when they got to where the house was, the firearms were there, the firearms were used, and that is confirmed by the cause of death as found by the pathologist. In respect of count 11 and 12. Count 11, facilitating conspiracy to murder a person called Outlaw. Count 12, facilitating the murder of Outlaw. These two offenses relate to the death of a gentleman, the shooting death of a gentleman known as Outlaw. And the evidence again showed that Mr. Bryan was the prime mover behind this killing. And so what we are seeing here from the shooting incident by Fisheries, the planning to burn down the Torpedo Loan Company, the murder and arson inside Fisheries, and now this, is that, and the rest of the evidence is actually consistent with this, that no major incident took place without the approval of Mr. Bryan. Certainly no killing took place without his approval, his planning, his direction. That is very clear from the evidence. And all of these incidents up to now showed premeditation, planning, multiple attackers, use of firearm, all of them. The killing of the Rastaman again showed mover and architect. You are using the firearm. Make sure that you hold it in such a manner that the magazine doesn't fall out. And it appears that Mr. Morris didn't follow those instructions. So when the shooting began, the firearm, the magazine, in fact, fell out, and the other individual who was there began to shoot the Rasta man. Mr. Prince was designated as the gentleman who would take the firearms after the shooting to hide them. And Mr. Blake's role in this killing was to make a determination as to whether or not the target was there. So and in respect of count 19, again, Mr. Bryan was the prime mover there in this facilitation of the conspiracy to murder person unknown. And this was now a conspiracy between himself and Mr. Prince to shoot this unknown person. So all of that now indicates that the circumstances of the various offenses facilitated, and it should be noted that in respect of Dooley, in respect of Mr. Jermaine Bryan and Mr. Della Walker, and in respect of the Rastaman, all three resulted in deaths. Even though murder is in charge, they actually culminated in deaths. And what we have up to this point is 4 persons dying as a result of Mr. Bryan's leadership, planning, direction, and facilitation. All of these had multiple attackers, firearms, pre-planned and premeditated, arson attack in at least one, and clearly, since we know that the persons died, that is Mr. Jermaine Bryan and Mr. Della Walker, we know that they died from gunshot injuries. Plan was obvious. To go with the firearm, set the place alight. In the event that they try to escape, they'll be shot and killed. That was the plan. So either way, they're either going to stay inside there and burn to death, or they are going to be shot and killed should they try to escape. As it turned out, they were both burnt, but they died from, and shot, and they died from gunshot injuries. It should be noted as well that killing of the Rastaman, the shooting by the National Police Academy were in broad daylight. Indication then, and incidentally, no evidence that anyone was wearing a mask. So this is now a culture of impunity. I can shoot or organize a shooting anywhere, anytime, day and night. Doesn't matter. The incident by the inside fisheries count 7 and 8, that incident was nighttime. And in respect of count 19, That incident was also daytime. And I should make reference to count 25. That count failed on technical grounds. That is to say, the Crown didn't establish that ICE was alive at the time when the facilitation was done. But what was quite clear was that there was a criminal organization in existence, and they were traveling now from Spanish Town to Yorktown in search of the intended target. A number of persons were identified there, including Mr. Bryan, and what appeared to be firearms were taken from top banks in the vehicles up to Yorktown and then back to Spanish Town. So all of this showing persistent, consistent course of conduct that involved the use of firearms, either to kill or to cause serious bodily harm, or at the very least, wounding with intent or shooting with intent. All serious offenses. And so the cumulative evidence of the indicted counts, as well as the unindicted instances, clearly shows that Mr. Bryan was a leader of this criminal organization, and one of their purposes was murder and murder involving the use of firearms. Now, in terms of whether there were aggravating features, well, let us get to the starting point. In respect of the starting point for leadership of a criminal organization, in these circumstances here, we have identified the multiple attackers, use of guns, pre-planned and premeditation, arson where necessary, some murders committed in daylight, others by night, no evidence of efforts to conceal identity, committed over a period of time on an ongoing basis. So all of this shows that here was an organization that was operating with impunity. And so leading such an organization suggests that the starting point should be between 25 and 30 years. So in my view, the starting point here is 27 years for leadership of the organization. No aggravating factors to take it up further. But are there mitigating factors? Has no previous conviction. When to looking now at the social inquiry report, was said to have been loved by many in the community who saw him as a positive influence. There were those who thought otherwise. It appears that his father, who began his own life in crime, later became a man of peace, later converted to Rastafarianism, and left that part of his life behind. And the report indicates that his father was suggesting to him, or at least to the mother and to Mr. Bryan, that there should be this conversion to Rastafarianism. Well, clearly the father's efforts at conversion at that time didn't produce a desired fruit. And it wasn't Rastafarianism for the sake of Rastafarianism. The impression that I got from the report was that the father was saying this is a new way of living. This is a better way of living. So that is what the father was trying to suggest. But as I said, the father's efforts there were not successful. And so he was raised largely, if not exclusively, after a particular point in time by his mom. So while we take account of the absence of previous convictions and the opinion of some members of the community, that has to be balanced now against the way in which these crimes were committed and what led up to them. And as I indicated, they have actually resulted in the deaths of 4 persons. And so, in the context of this case, including considering the prospect of rehabilitation, it is difficult to see any good reason why the sentence on leadership should be reduced other than for the time already spent in custody. And as I indicated earlier, the evidence shows that it does not appear that Mr. Bryan intended to give up his life of crime unless or until he was caught by the police, which has now happened. Given the way that the organization operated, it was one in which violence was a constant part of the way in which it conducted its affairs. And that violence extended to murder and arson and shootings. So the sentence now has to be disabling Mr. Bryan from being able to conduct this kind of activity for an extended period of time. Now, in his plea mitigation, Mr. McFarlane indicated that the fact that Mr. Bryan insists on his innocence should not be held against him. Mr. Bryan says he's capable of reform, and I will never say that anybody is incapable of reform as a philosophical idea, as a practical, not as a practical matter, but as a philosophical idea. You can't say nobody or anybody is incapable of reform, but as to whether now, based upon the material, the evidence is there to suggest that. I must confess that I'm hard-pressed to see it, and as I indicated, it was his arrest that interrupted his leadership of the criminal organization. What the evidence shows is that Mr. Bryan was a man of extreme violence and was not afraid or hesitated to kill and to kill again and again and again to further his aims as he saw it. Mr. McFarlane indicated, which I agree with, that counts 7 and 8 should be seen together, meaning they relate to the same incident. And same argument was made in respect of counts 11 and 12. And I agree with that. But counts 6, 15, and 19 are sort of standalone in that they are not paired with any other count on the indictment, at least not just yet. So Mr. McFarlane had suggested that the sentences on count 7 and 8 should be concurrent. I have no disagreement with that. And also that the sentences on counts 11 and 12 should be concurrent. I have no difficulty with that either. Now for the offenses other than count 1, these are facilitation offense. Well, that's not quite true. They're all facilitation offenses except, well, let me rephrase it. You have facilitation of a substantive offense such as murder, and you have facilitation of conspiracy. Let's put it that way more accurately. So the count 7 is facilitation of murder. Count 8, facilitation of arson. Count 11, facilitation of conspiracy to murder. Count 12, facilitation of murder. Count 15, facilitation of murder. And count 19, facilitation of conspiracy to murder. So what I understood counsel to be saying is that at the very least, though I think he was hoping otherwise, but at the very least, in respect of the facilitation of the conspiracies, the sentences should be lower or certainly not the same as the facilitation of the substantive offense of, say, murder and arson. That is how I understood the facilitation offenses did 3 things, as I said before. They assisted in establishing that a criminal organization existed. They assisted in establishing that Mr. Bryan was a leader of the criminal organization, and that they showed that the offenses were committed over a period of time. So we're going to be grouping count 7 and 8 as one, count 11 and 12 as another, and then we'll look at count 6, 15, and 19 as standalone offenses. So having regard to the evidence as outlined in respect of counts 7 and 8, where Mr. Bryan was identified as one of the persons by the church who went over, the group of persons, along with the driver who went over to fisheries, and what Mr. Bryan said before he went over to fisheries, they're going to be shelling down over there, and when you look at all the circumstances, including the distribution or at least the visible display of what appeared to be firearms, as well as the Molotov cocktail, which was in open, unimpeded view, according to the driver, made it clear that, at the very least, mayhem of some kind involving, at the very least, serious bodily harm and possibly property damage would be taking place that evening. And Mr. Bryan facilitated those intended activities and facilitated the actual occurrence of those activities. So bearing in mind all the circumstances concerning count 7 and 8, and keeping in mind that the maximum penalty is 20 years, and keeping in mind as well that in respect of count 7 and 8, death of 2 persons were the outcome of the activity, it is my view that the starting point here should be 17 years for count 7. Right. In respect of count 8, starting point, in my view, should be 17 years as well, since the whole idea of going over there was to either kill the persons by shooting or by burning or both. It turned out that their bodies were burnt inside the house and they died from gunshot injuries. So in either way, whether it was by arson or by shooting, the clear intention was to kill these 2 persons. So the starting point, in my view, for count 17 and 18 should be 17 years. 7 and 8 should be 17 years. No aggravating features to put it up. Question is whether there are any mitigating features to bring it down. Having regard to all the circumstances here, I think it's a standstill, nothing to bring it up or to take it down. So we remain at 17 years for counts 7 and 8. And in particular because it resulted in the death of 2 persons. They resulted in the death of 2 persons. So now we come to counts 11 and 12. Count 11, facilitating a conspiracy to murder, and count 12 facilitating the actual murder of the same person. Those offenses should be taken together, as in sentences will be concurrent. So what is the appropriate sentence there? I'm just trying to find my notes here. Right. So in respect of the conspiracy to murder, facilitating that offense in respect of count 11, yes, it is connected to count 12, but count 12 resulted in the death of one individual as distinct from two. So I think the starting point should be lower. And so, in my view, the starting point for the conspiracy to facilitating the conspiracy to murder should be 10 years. That is on count 11. In respect of count 12, the starting point should be 12 years. Why 12 years? Keeping in mind that when you're dealing with count 7, there are two persons who suffered death there. Now we have a situation where you had one person, and so the sentence ought to reflect the difference between two persons dying as opposed to one person dying. I'm not saying that one life is inherently more valuable than another, but the number of persons who die should make a difference, and it does in this particular case. So, in count, did I say what the number of years should be? Respect of count 12? 12 years, right. 12 years, right. Then now you have count 6. Which is a standalone count. And trying to give effect to the different principles and weighing the different principles that I outlined earlier in respect of count 6. It's resulted in the death of one person. It's a shooting death, similar to count 12. I mean, there are differences in the sense that in respect of count 12, it is said that Mr. Bryan drove by or was near to the vicinity of where the gentleman in count 12 was shot and killed, but that is not a sufficient difference to make it more aggravating or less aggravating as the circumstances are very similar. So in respect of count 6, the starting point is also 12 years there. We're now at 15. That involved the murder of the Rastaman that was facilitated, planned and encouraged by Mr. Bryan. So the starting point there, to me, again, is 12 years. And that takes us to count 19. That was facilitating conspiracy to murder someone unknown. Very similar to count 10. And so the starting point there is count 11. Count 11 is 10 years. One that's missing. I've dealt with counts. Just a moment. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I dealt with counts 11 and 12. Have I covered all of them? Yes. Right. Just making sure. Right. So where we are now is right. So count 1, I said was 27. Right. So starting point then for count 1, 27 years. Count 7 and 8, 17 years each. counts 11 and 12, count 11, 10 years. Count 12, 12 years. Count 6, 12 years. Count 15, 12 years. Count 19, 10 years. Starting points. Now, as I said, in none of these, I see any aggravating factors to increase the number of years. Are there any mitigating factors in these circumstances to warrant a reduction, other than the fact of no previous convictions? I am not convinced that there are any mitigating factors here to warrant any reduction. So the starting point remains the end point. So what Mr. Bryan has been in custody 5.5 years. So when they take away the 5.5 years, so in count 1, that leaves us with 21 and a half years. 5 from, yes. For count 6. That leaves us with 6.5 years. I'm going to reduce for all counts. All counts. Respect of count 7, that would be 11.5 years. For count 8, it's 11.5 years. For count 11, that's 4.5 years. For count 12, that's 6.5 years. For count 15, that's 6.5 years. And for count 19, that's 4.5 years. Okay. Now, I'd say that I'd agree with Mr. McFarlane that the sentences on counts 7 and 8 should be concurrent. So sentences on counts 7 and 8 are concurrent. So that's 11.5 years there. In respect of the sentences on count 11 and 12 concurrently, to run concurrently, so that gives you a maximum there of 6.5 years. Right. So that leaves us now with counts 6 15 and the 19 and what to do with them. And count 1. What to do with them. Now, in this case, I think that the question of consecutive sentences should be considered. What is the principle relating to consecutive sentences? In principle, it's permissible. What the decisions indicate is that where the offenses arise out of the same circumstance, then in principle you should not have consecutive sentences. The court should look to see whether they can have a substantial sentence on the major offense, and then the other sentences be made to run concurrently along with the major offense. But consecutive sentences are appropriate if the circumstances are such that the sentences, unless made to run consecutively, would not reflect the true criminality of what was involved. Here we have a gentleman who was a leader and a part of an organization that involved murder, shooting, and at least arson as well. We have a situation in which 4 persons died. Yes, 4. Part of count 19. We had Dooley, we had Mr. Bryan, Miss Walker, Outlaw, and who else? And the Rastaman. There's 5 persons who died as a result of his activity. But for, as I said, the quirk in our criminal practice and procedure, he may very well have been prosecuted for the full offense of murder. But we are where we are with that. So, in my view, there should be consecutive sentences to reflect the full scope of the criminality and to ensure that the level of offending, the scale of the offending, the scope of the offending, the extent of the offending are adequately addressed at this phase of the trial. So, this is where we are now. So I have count 1, which is 23 years. Right. Let me cut and paste here. Cut. Right. Count 1, which is 21.5 years. And I had indicated that the unindicted offenses had established that Mr. Bryan is a leader of the criminal organization. And then the indicted offenses also established that he was a leader of the criminal organization. but they extended the scope over which the offenses occurred, and therefore enabled the Crown to adduce all of that evidence to establish that he was the leader. And in that context now, it was leader of a violent organization. So that is how we end up now at the 21 years. I have also said that the sentences on count 7 and 8 are concurrent, and the sentences on counts 11 and 12 are concurrent. So the sentences now on counts 6, 15 and 19. Yes? Count 6, 15 and 19. Are to run concurrently with the sentence on count 1. Sentences on 6, 15, and 19 to run concurrently with the sentence on count 1. Got that, Mr. Registrar? Got that? So you have the sentence for count 1 and the sentence for counts 6, 15, and 19 to run concurrently with the sentence on count 1. Got that? Okay. Right. Now, the sentence on counts 11 and 12. With me so far? Sentences on counts 11 and 12 to run consecutive to the sentence on count 1. With me so far? And now the sentences on counts 7 and 8. Yes? Sentences on count 7 and 8 to be consecutive to the sentence on counts 11 and 12. With me? The sentence is on counts 11 and 12. So the sentence on count 6, 15, and 19 concurrently with the sentence on count 1. Sentence on count 11 and 12 consecutive to the sentence on count 1, and count 7 and 8 consecutive to the sentences on counts 11 and 12. Everybody got that? There's 2 consecutive sentences. You got that? I've covered all the counts. I've covered all the counts, yes? So it's 21 and a half plus 6 and a half plus 11 and a half. It's 21 and a half plus 6 and a half plus 11 and a half. There's a total of 39 and a half. Got that? Got that, Madam Court Reporter? Okay, right. So that's it then for Mr. Bryan. You can please remove him from the dock, please, Mr. Bryan. That's 39 and a half years in all. Okay? Right.